In 1999, I took a job out in Phoenix, Arizona as a project manager for a steel fabricator, PDM Strocal actually. And I was able to work on some really big projects. As the project manager for, I built two 911 centers for the city of LA. I did an office and studio for George Lucas, Lucasfilms up in the Napa Valley, and some high profile stuff. But on one of the projects, um, it was right after I turned 40. I was in the office of one of the larger architects in Los Angeles. We had a problem with the project with the 911 centers, and the people in the room, there were representatives from the mayor's office, there were engineers, there were representatives from a lot of different contractors. And I was there representing PDM. It's a 108-year-old company. And the head architect was in my face, and he said, "You will do this." And I was in his face saying, "You will do this." And fortunately, one of the other contractors made a concession, and both both the head architect and myself were able to save face. And after the meeting, I went downstairs and I was getting in my rent-a-car and getting ready to fly back to Phoenix. And I thought, this is so cool. I get to go back and tell my bosses how much, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars that I had saved them. And I was thinking, this is really cool. This feels nice. But this ain't me. This ain't what I do. I flew back to Arizona and explained everything to the bosses and began to think, this is not where I need to be. This is not what I need to be doing. Even though I was making a ton of money, I was paid enough. I called it golden handcuffs. I was paid enough to where I couldn't leave. I had a couple of pieces of property. I had nice vehicles. My wife was making a lot of money, and things were really good. But it wasn't filling me, this part of me. And so I started looking at getting out of the business and how to find my purpose, what it is I'm supposed to be doing. And on the way to work, Dr. Wayne Dyer, had just written a book, 60 Days to Spiritual Enlightenment, Wisdom of the Ages is the subtitle. And so he was on the radio talking about his book. And it sounded exactly like what I was looking for, how to find your purpose. And so I bought the book, had it sent to me, read it, and within a few weeks I knew that I was getting out of the business. And then my father came to see me. I had just turned 40 and my father was 70. And my father had been in the steel business all his life. And having my father there in Arizona and showing him all, how successful his son was and the projects that I was working on and that kind of stuff. But I realized that if I don't get out of the business now, I'm looking at me. I'm looking at my father, 70 years old. That's going to be me. He's successful, he's happy, he's good at his business, well respected in the field. But that wasn't what I wanted for me. And a few weeks later, 9/11 happened. And by then, I was already heading out the door. I started a archery manufacturing business because as a result of the book, after reading Wayne Dyer's book, there's only two things that I thought that I was built for, either archery or recovery from addiction. I've been in recovery now. This coming year will be 34 years in recovery for alcohol and drug addiction. And so I knew there's no money in working in recovery. So I started this archery manufacturing business, talked to some people, talked to my competitors. Everybody said do it. It was the thing to do. But what happened is that as a result of starting that company, Canyon State Archery was the name of the company. And I built a lot of different type archery equipment, but I specialized in Native American bows. And I built some bows for the Hyatt Regency, Scottsdale Hyatt Regency. And they still have them there, but they put them on display because it was the 200th anniversary of Lewis and Clark's trip out west. That's a whole nother story. But as a result of going to the Hyatt, and they asked me to build these bows, and I did a reenactment for Lewis and Clark's trip out west. It's bizarre stuff, but I was making more money than most lawyers and doctors make. And again, it's money. It's fine, but it's just money. But what it got me to doing, on one of my bows, I had written a reference to a piece of scripture. Acts chapter 9, verse 1 through 6, which is where Paul is on the road to Damascus and gets struck down by the Lord, and he turns his life around. And that was what had happened to me when I came into recovery, that, I rolled a car over, things happened, and I got a different path as a result of that. And so it got me to, I put that on my bow, and it got me to talking about my faith in front of a lot of people, a lot of strangers, and talking in public, giving lectures about archery, about Lewis and Clark, about living in the frontier in the year 1803, 1804, talking in front of people. A few weeks later, I ended up going back to Georgia. My wife at the time said that she felt as though we needed to go back home. It's a long story, but I was back in Georgia. And at the end of the street where I moved, this house in the middle of nowhere, at the end of the street was a Baptist church. And I thought, I hope there's not a bunch of weird people in that church, because it would really be convenient to go to church there. That was in May. I was ordained as a Baptist pastor in that church in the following April. So almost a year later, I was ordained. A few weeks later, I ended up going to Bruton Parker. I enrolled there, and again, it's a God thing. But Bruton Parker was going to send some of their students to Minsk, Belarus for spring break to do some evangelical work. And you could get 3 hours college credit for about the same amount of money. I thought, okay, I care nothing about Eastern Europe, but okay. And because of some political situations in Belarus, they decided to send us to Russia instead, Krasnodar, Russia. And when we got ready to go, I'm in the airport in Atlanta, and I'm talking to some people about, they said, who are you, and what do you do? And I said, well, I'm a newly ordained Baptist pastor. I'm in recovery for alcohol and drugs. And they said, oh, there's a huge problem with alcohol and drugs in Russia. Wouldn't it be nice if you went to Russia and helped alcoholics? And I said, no. I said, when I graduate in 2007, I want to go to Africa and work with orphans from the AIDS epidemic and teach them how to make a living. And so got on the plane, and sitting next to me was a man by the name of Frank Van Dalen, and he was the executive director of foreign missions for the Associate Reformed Presbyterian Church. And Frank was going to shut down a program in Moscow that trained Russians to be alcohol and drug counselors because they had just lost their director, and nobody knew anything about addiction. And so he asked me what I thought, and I said, well, you should shut it down. We talked for about 8 hours on the plane, but I said, you should shut it down. I said, you don't know anything about addiction. Those people don't know anything about addiction. You're just throwing money down a hole. And he gave me his business card, and he said, let me make sure I understand something. He said, you're an ordained Baptist preacher. And I said, yeah. He said, you've survived your addiction. I said, yeah. He said, you've been in recovery now. Then it was 19 years. I said, yeah. He said, and you want to be a missionary? I said, yeah. And your life is arranged where you can be a missionary? I said, yeah. He said, do you know how unusual those 5 things are? And I said, Frank, I'm in a 12-step program that deals with miracles every day. I said, but it does sound a little strange. Got off the plane in Moscow and flew down to Krasnodar. And talking to the interpreters down there who were former Peace Corps. And they, we're all sitting around having tea, and they said, who are you and why are you here? And I said, well, I'm a newly ordained pastor, recovering for alcohol and drugs. And they said, well, there's a big problem with alcohol and drugs here in Russia. Wouldn't it be nice if you came and helped? And I said, no, I'm going to Africa in the spring of 2007, as soon as I graduate, and work with orphans from the AIDS epidemic. Now, this is 3, because I told Frank the same story. So this is 3 people. And they said, oh, there's a huge problem with alcohol and drugs in Russia. Wouldn't it be nice if you came and worked with alcoholics? And I said, no, going to Africa. And so in Krasnodar, I stayed at a seminary. We taught at a seminary. And there was a student there who worked at an alcohol and drug treatment center. And he asked, could I speak to the patients? And I said, sure. But before that, we ended up going down to Sochi. And in Sochi, I preached at a home church. 12 people in the room. They didn't have a permit to have a church, so basically it was against the law what they were doing. And if somebody had come to investigate, they would have arrested the owner of the flat and whoever was preaching, which was me. And so I talked to him for about 15 minutes about what Christ had done for me and how my life had turned around. And at the train station, they said, well, there's a huge problem with alcohol and drugs here in Russia. Wouldn't it be nice if you could come and work with alcoholics here? And I said, yeah, but I'm going to Africa as soon as I graduate. Work with orphans from the AIDS epidemic. I said, but it is interesting how things are playing out. This is number 4. And so on the way back to Krasnodar, I'm getting beat over the head with this stuff. And so I'm not sure what to make of what's happening. What is God trying to tell me? In Krasnodar, I went and I spoke at the seminary. And when the student asked me to come and speak at his alcohol and drug rehab, I said, yeah. So we all go there, and I spoke again for about 15 minutes about what God had done for me and how my life had been turned around, and I told them briefly about the 12 steps. Now, this was a tough place to get sober. They didn't have any program. They just basically read the Bible and prayed and hoped that God would save them. And like I do, that God's been sobering up alcoholics since there have been alcoholics, since Noah. But it's easier it's like diabetes. It's easier if you go to your doctor, you do what your doctor says, you follow his recommendations, you watch what you eat, that kind of stuff, get some exercise. It's easier if you've got a program, something to do. And so I spoke to these guys for a little while, and 2 heroin addicts followed me outside. And standing in the snow with tears in their eyes, they said, can't you come back and help us? And I said, just as fast as I can. I said, I'm already trying to figure it out. Flew back to the States. And I talked to the mission board for the Southern Baptist Convention, International Mission Board, and talked to them on the phone. And the sound that your record player makes when you drag the needle across the record? When I told him I had been divorced, that's the sound that I heard coming through the phone. I never even got to the part where I told him I was alcoholic and a drug addict. We never got that far. And so after that phone call, I called Frank, the guy who sat next to me on the plane. And Frank got real quiet on the phone. And he said, well, can you come and talk to me? So I drove over to Columbia, South Carolina. We talked for a few minutes, and he said, Chip, you were right. I should close that program, but they're doing such good work. Can't you go back to Moscow and take a look at it and tell me what you think? And I said, yeah, sure, it's fine. So I went back to Moscow, and standing in the airport, the Moscow airport is not the most organized place. And when I got off the plane, standing in the airport was a little bitty woman with a big sign over her head that said, Otis Taylor. And I thought, I have come to save an entire continent, which is an egotistical thing to think. You certainly don't want that in a missionary. You certainly don't want that in a pastor. That kind of thinking almost killed me a few years later. But she got me in the plane, or got me in the car, and her husband was driving, and she spoke English, and she said, "Mr. Taylor, I know who you are, but why are you here?" And I said, "Well, I met these people in the airport in Atlanta, and they said y'all had a big problem over here." And then I sat next to some guy on the plane, Frank Van Dalen. I think you know him. And she said, "Oh, Mr. Taylor, you're the Miracle Man." And I said, "Ma'am?" And she said, "Yeah." I said, "Frank was here, and he told us that he met this guy on the plane who knew all about alcoholism, was going to move to Moscow, run the program, and solve all our problems." And I said, "Ma'am, when he told you that in March, I was going to Africa." And she said, "Yeah, we're supposed to pray about it." And so the whole time I was down in Kransador and Sochi, and the Holy Spirit's beating me over the head with what's going on, they're up in Moscow praying about it. I said, "Look, I don't speak your language. I'm not a member of your denomination. I got a farm in Georgia." I said, "But after what happened to me, I'm not going to take anything off the table." I said, "I will at least look at the whole situation and see what I can do." And every one of the barriers that were, I thought, holding me back from going to Moscow just fell away. I moved there, that was March of 2006, and I went back and forth for a couple of years. In 2008, I swore I'd never go again because I was being beat up by the good guys and the bad guys. But I moved there full time in 2009, moved everything out of Moscow to Ukraine, and the political situation in Russia was just getting worse and worse. Started school in Melitopol, Ukraine, training Russians and Ukrainians to be alcohol and drug counselors. And I've been here ever since. And this is now 2020, almost 2021. There's a lot of stuff that happened to get me here. And I'm just trying to stay out of the way. God in his infinite wisdom continues to open up doors. Now I'm here in Zalisa, Ukraine, on a small farm. I got a treatment center that I run. We make Mexican food for expatriates in Kiev because we don't have any funding. So we have to make our own money. And I do that through making Mexican food for Americans living in Ukraine. It's bizarre stuff, but it seems to be the path that I was put on for a purpose. Thanks for listening.